Good evening, everyone. I was going to say in the beginning, already prepared, of course, that it's a great honor and a distinct pleasure to be here. To be perfectly honest, after hearing each of you introduce yourselves, I have to say I am doubly honored and triply, distinctly pleased to be here, but also very much humbled. And I'm very grateful to Reverend Lee, as well as to Do-Yoon for the invitation and the openness and the opportunity to be here with you. Many of you have mentioned that obviously when Reverend Lee says come, you come. That definitely applies to me, and I always look forward to it because I know that this will be one of the few opportunities in a year to learn and to share in a space which is safe and nourishing intellectually and spiritually. And so it is always actually quite something to look forward to. And I want to say a very warm thanks for this opportunity. You will have noticed that I am asked to speak to how to strengthen partnership between the UN and the world's religions. And I wasn't quite sure how long we had. But I wanted to share in the same spirit as Reverend Lee has. I wanted to share a few things with you, and that is that many of you have mentioned how delighted you are to be here. And I want to say I'm actually not just delighted, but quite relieved, because I have heard so much about this place, and I have seen Reverend Lee in her journey, parts of it, to make this a reality. And I'm just so relieved that it has finally happened, and I am comparing how she looks today, and she's blooming, and it's just such a joy to be able to see her and Do-Yoon looking so affirmed in their conviction and vindicated in what they wanted to do. And it's a pleasure to be able to partake of that particular wealth of spirit that they bring to the table. I just heard that Robin ran for state senate, so I'm just thrilled to be sitting next to somebody who actually does that. My only experience of this kind of thing has been through movies and the TV, watching the news, so it's absolutely amazing, and I've urged her to please write a book about it so one can actually see what the experiences have been and learn a thing or two. So I will follow in the footsteps and share a few narratives of strengthening the partnership between the United Nations and the world's religions. And I just wanted to share with you, first of all, what many of you probably know very well, which is that the United Nations is not one thing. It's not one organization, one building called the United Nations. It's a very complex, huge world. It has 60, at least, different agencies, bodies, and offices dealing with everything imaginable, from the little things under the sea, to the sky, there is, for every single domain of life, there's probably, I'll bet you anything, there'll be a UN office or agency working on it. And if there isn't, it shall be done to make sure that we have that specific attention paid to this particular issue. So you can well imagine, with everything that goes on around us, with a specialized office and a specialized desk and a specialized officer, we are a world unto ourselves. We even have, some of us jokingly referred to as UNEs as our language, mostly a great deal of acronyms strung together. And I will wager that if any of you were to read one of our official documents, you would be flummoxed to try to figure out what exactly in that one sentence is the attempt to say and what they're referring to. The good news is that after a while you actually do figure it out, so it's not completely incoherent. Having said that, I think there nevertheless remains something that is called the UN culture. It's the culture of the United Nations system. This is a very rich culture. It's made by the people who work as staff members in these various multitudinal offices that are all over the world. So you have UN headquarters, which for some strange reason are always based in the Western world. So there's New York, Geneva, Vienna, Rome, not exactly poor places. At the same time, the work of the United Nations is almost exclusively carried out in poor countries, developing countries. There are no programs that the UN, for instance, will be running anywhere in the United Kingdom or the United States or France or Germany or Italy or Belgium or anywhere like that. Most of our work, if not 99.9% of our work, is actually located in the developing world. So why are we based in headquarters? Why are we headquartered in this part of the world? Your guess is as good as mine. My understanding is that that's because where the money is. And we do need to raise the money to make sure we can fund the projects and programs and issues that are taking place all over the world. Part of the culture of the United Nations system is its staff, as I said, but much more so, the UN is an intergovernmental entity. It is quintessentially a body of all the governments, 192 of them, that come together. Now, you all know that any one government has its own complex cultures and way of operating and way of talking and representing and different opinions, to put it mildly. So you can well imagine when 192 governments come together to try to agree on something. Diplomatically put, it can be quite a challenge. Not so diplomatically put, it is frankly quite difficult to get agreements on many, many things for the United Nations. Having said that, the structure of the United Nations system, which was created sometime back in 1945, remains a little bit problematic. You have a General Assembly in which everybody partakes, but you have a Security Council, which is really the heart of the system, in which only specific countries are permanent members, and there are only 5, and the rest rotate. So you can well imagine that there's a lot of power politics going on. Who gets to be on the Security Council at which moment in time? What that will entail in terms of horse trading or whatever it is, the politics of who and how and why is a very big feature of the system. And then you have all these other agencies and mechanisms and bodies, each working on a different facet, usually working at their best when 2 are repeating exactly the same kind of work in exactly the same country without talking to one another. I neglected to mention, now that I'm getting into it, that I am not speaking on behalf of the United Nations. Minor observation, small caveat. My name is Azza, and I happen to be a student of the United Nations system and a student of religion and a student of Venerable Chung for many, many years. So actually, please listen to me as somebody who works in the UN system, but I am by no means officially speaking on behalf of the UN system. It is a great and distinct privilege to be a member of the United Nations staff. It is also something that means that if I was to speak formally, I would have had to get approximately 20 signatures that would have allowed me to formally speak on behalf of the UN system, and frankly, I wouldn't have made it in time. So the alternative is that I can be here with you as Azza, who happens to work in the United Nations Population Fund, which is one of the 60 funds, mechanisms, offices of the UN system. And I do admit I am deeply privileged to be in that position, and I'm learning a great deal. So, the other thing that forms the culture of the United Nations, we are supposed to be coming from all over the world, the staff, the member states, the governments. We are 192 countries. You can well imagine that the staff of the UN also reflects that cultural diversity. But we never talk about our own culture. There is no such thing as a UN culture that you can read about or be informed of. It is the subtext, always, to who we are and what we do. When I was first recruited to serve in this role as the advisor on culture at the United Nations Population Fund, first of all, it was deemed rather odd that this fund would require an office on culture or a person working on culture. And it was largely due to the foresight, I think, of the the executive officer in that particular fund, and she happened to be a Saudi Arabian lady who believed that you can't really do much without culture, without religion, without faith, that it is integral and foundational to the way that we behave and who we are and what we do. Am I going to need to shout soon? No. Okay, sorry. And it was primarily because of her push that the UN Population Fund acquired this post of a culture advisor. Now, remember I told you how the UN loves to replicate and do the same thing twice if at all possible, I mean minimally twice. There is also something called the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Some of you may well have heard it, very much involved with cultural heritage sites. You may have heard of cultural, UNESCO sites that are being protected in certain countries and so on. And the UNESCO colleagues were always very flummoxed. Why would you need another culture person? Surely we have an entire UN agency on culture. If you need anything to do with culture, come to us. They happen to be based in Paris, but that's quite okay. The rest of the world should be able to go to Paris for culture. It was a very, if you will, a very unorthodox decision, and I did not mean that pun, to have this Office of Culture within the United Nations Population Fund. And the argument that went is this: when you're dealing with population issues, that is birth, everything from the moment of birth to the moment you die, just a minor continuum of a human life, when you're dealing with having sex, deciding whether or not you're going to do contraceptives, how many children you're going to have, what kind of life they will lead in what part of the world, where they're going to live, what kind of health access they will receive. When you're dealing with these issues, it is not a question of whether you can do culture and religion or not. It is a question of how you're going to approach the religious issues and the religious dilemmas that are often going to be encountered head on. And even if the UN Population Fund would have liked not to deal with religion and culture, which is the norm in the UN system and has been for a long time, it's changing now, and I'm getting to that in a second. But if we want to deal with this mandate, we cannot but have to understand what it means, what value is, what are values, what is faith for people, why religions, what religious institutions, what do they look like, how do they operate, why are they angry with us a lot of the time, why does our mandate keep getting misrepresented and misunderstood, etc. So for the United Nations Population Fund, the need to engage with religion and religious issues was never really a matter of choice. It was almost an obligation. If you're going to deal with some of the most sensitive issues in human life, you will have to. You cannot avoid but to deal with religion. And you might as well do it in a proper way rather than in a haphazard ad hoc way. But the moral of the story is you have a position on culture which is meant to then bring to light what the cultural dynamics are. What is culture? Why culture? How culture? And the very first thing I thought we could do when I first joined, very naively, was, gee, maybe we could look at the culture of the organization. We have about 2,500 staff all over the world. So what is the cultural dynamics right here, in this entity? And I was told, and this was something that is repeated throughout the UN system, I was told, our culture is fine, thank you very much. Kindly go and focus on the cultures of those people we have to serve, ultimately in these countries out there. Within here, culture's good, culture's fine. Multicultural, we all respect each other, we all love each other, everything is just fine. Now, it doesn't really take a genius to figure out that answer in and of itself belies quite a lot of issues that have never quite come to light, but are gently coming to light in ways that you'd rather they wouldn't. So we have a very fascinating dynamic of, we don't talk about culture within the United Nations system so much unless it is this building in this country over there, these people in that country over there, this institution in that place over there. That is how we have approached culture traditionally, and we continue to do so. Our own internal culture, which incidentally I firmly believe is the wealth of the United Nations system, is the strongest foundation, the backbone of the UN system, is our culture. It's who we are and what we bring as individuals to the table. Whether we happen to be from the non-governmental sector, whether we happen to be representing governments, whether we happen to be staff members, the United Nations system is unique precisely because of the wealth of humanity that it brings together to work within it and to represent it. But that has to be the subtext for the UN system. And because that is the subtext, the way that we have approached religion tends to be a little bit warped, because it is about, okay, now that we're going to deal with religion out there, but we're okay, and we don't really talk about it, we don't know who comes from what religion, we're not supposed to know who comes from what religion, absolutely not. And please don't go there, because there are so many issues that might happen, and it's tough enough trying to figure out that one person is from this part of the world, another person is that part of the world, they might be having a civil war, fighting each other, and it's complicated enough. Don't bring religion into the equation. So it is with that foundation that we then approach the religions and the religions of the world and what impact they have on people. So if you can think about it, we're approaching it slightly blinkered in our perspective. So, religion, okay. who's out there that is religious, and what are we supposed to deal with? Okay, religious institutions. We've got the church, there's this, the archbishop here, there's this imam there, okay, how do we have to work with them? Yes, let's invite them to this meeting, wonderful, grand. What do they do exactly in the meeting? Well, ideally, they could probably say a few prayers in the beginning. No, we don't do that. We don't do that. Okay, well, perhaps we could just have them at the policy table when we're discussing plans, what we're going to do, how we're going to do certain things, how we're going to approach certain programs. Hunger, how do you tackle, who's going to do what, how... Yes. Well, we have to check with the governments first. Do the governments really think that we need to have these religious people at the table? And very often the governments would think, why do you need to have the religious? We're here. We represent everybody, religious, non-religious. We're here. This is the ministry. This is the minister. We're all at the table. You're okay. You're okay. Don't worry about the religious side. But then we have to deliver services. In the work of the UNFPA, to give you an example, one of the things that we try to do is to deliver medical services and make sure that all the medicines and the equipment and the tools are available to the ministries of health and others who are working in the medical field to provide medical services. One of our jobs is to make sure that this stuff is available, the material, the issues that are available. Then we finally realize at some point in time, we've spent millions of dollars building clinics because we were told there is no clinic for women to give birth in this particular area. It's too remote, there are no medical services up there, there are no medical clinics, so we say, well, that's okay, well, World Bank, we need to build a road so that that commute becomes feasible. WHO, World Health Organization, how about we work together with UNFPA, we build this particular hospital or clinic in this area, make sure, I don't know who else is going to provide the medicine, Ministry of Health undertakes the project, the place is set up, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, and guess what, it's not used. And you think, but we've done the roads, we've provided the transport, we've got the medical equipment, we've got the what's the problem? Somebody overlooked to mention that if you have the doctors and the nurses wearing white, because that's of course what doctors, nurses wear white robes, no? Actually, in that particular community, white is associated with death. So they're rather unlikely to go give birth in that particular setting. And you think, that was just a minor oversight. We ended up spending millions because we were totally led, good intentions to create that hospital or that clinic. We didn't quite look at who would be using it and what they might actually, the way they think, what they believe and how they behave, whether or not they're actually going to use the blessed thing that we set up. That was when the general understanding, perhaps we should invest some time in understanding why people behave in certain ways, what pushes them to behave that way, and who can help us influence them and them influence us so that we can learn a little bit about, gee, maybe we could provide the same services, but maybe they don't need to wear white. Very simple. But it took years and millions of dollars to come to that basic realization. Another example, in certain communities in Latin America, amongst the indigenous communities, women would never give birth lying horizontally. Absolutely not done, ever, for generations. And here we are, we've provided them with the latest, the most whatever, but please sleep horizontally. No, won't happen. They won't come to the clinics. And guess what? I forgot to mention a small oversight. Do you realize that every minute there is a woman in the world dying as a result of childbirth or as a result of complications that happen during childbirth because of a lack of somebody skilled who could be with this woman who's giving birth every minute. So by the time we finish the talk tonight, you can calculate how many women have died somewhere around the world during childbirth or as a result of totally preventable complications that arise during that childbirth. So do we really, in practice, have the luxury of not being able to understand how people behave and believe and why? Frankly, I don't think we do. But that I tend to be a bit of a weird person. Here is a realization that they do not, the mothers in this community, will not give birth lying flat. It takes a little bit of exercise, a little bit of investment to learn that there are traditional birthing methods. It's much better described on a video than it is by me. But they need ropes, the ropes hang from somewhere, they sit on them, They hold them, they tug at them when they're giving birth. And they give birth sitting in that position or squatting. It takes another couple of years to convince the government and the Ministry of Health that it might be a good idea to include that gadget, that mechanism, within those very same clinics, safe spaces, sanitized, etc., but include that and give them the option that they can give birth that way. At least she'll be in a place where there are skilled birth attendants who can look after her and save her and the baby's lives. That's the kind of work that culture entails. And it, for some reason, it is perceived as the soft side of development. We'll get to it when we do the rest of the serious stuff. Build the roads, get the transportation right, put the finances in place. And actually, it is probably just as important, if not more so, simply to have queried people and their beliefs. But the other part of it is being able to understand why certain people believe that you are not supposed to go and access a medical institution and get some help. Why you're not supposed to? Because these people, like you would have recently heard, polio vaccinations, very bad for you, they cause infertility, let's kill them off. Do we need to just ignore them and pretend that they're wacko and go ahead and do our own, continue business as usual? Actually, no. We need to figure out why they have been going around with that misunderstanding in mind and killing the very same people who are there to provide the vaccination that is meant to save lives. That engagement requires time, energy, dedication, effort. Of course it requires money. That is the thing that is very difficult to get the culture of the United Nations and those who do international development assistance to accept in the first place, especially when you're based in London, New York, Geneva, Vienna, and Rome, etc. You know, you need to be able to understand that you do have to invest in that kind of effort to bring on board the people, precisely the kinds of people whom you would rather really avoid. But they are the ones who are also shaping not just behaviors, but they're also impacting ultimately on saving human lives. When we first started this work in the UN system approximately a decade ago, what you're hearing today of the general celebrations in the General Assembly, 3 years ago only would have been unheard of. 3 years from now, God willing, it will be something that everybody looks forward to in the UN system, whether they come from a government, whether they come from the private sector, whether they come from media, it'll be the event, because the spirit of that General Assembly will have changed. The very air of the General Assembly will have changed. We're getting there slowly, but one of the things we had to say to our colleagues, the member states, the colleagues who head all these headquarter units, who were very, very skeptical as to why you needed to engage with faith and religion and what for. Now we could have chosen to say values, faith, UN values, faith, confluence, human rights, which is of course the sacred language of the United Nations system, it's human rights, similarity with this faith and that faith and that faith, they go together, they're coterminous. People have been saying that for centuries. We could have chosen to go that route. But there was a deliberate decision not to go that route. Instead, let's look at who actually provides some of the most basic services in communities around the world. Health, education, basic health and education services. Who provides them? We realized after a lot of research that was undertaken by WHO and a bunch of others that actually a minimum of 30% of basic health care is provided through faith-based or faith-inspired organizations around the world. We realized that in countries where there is conflict and the basic services are extraordinarily difficult to access, that at least 60% of basic health care, not to mention nutrition, not to mention education services, all of which gets completely goes in a situation of war and conflict. You know, you can well imagine, you've seen these images and you've lived some in these contexts, but you've also seen some of the images. There isn't anything, there's not even a place where you can go and get your vaccination, get your aspirin, for heaven's sake. 60% of basic health care in conflict situations is provided through and by faith-based or faith-inspired organizations. So you come back to the UN system and you think you're working with a Ministry of Health that at best is able to deliver to 70% of its population. On a good day, that leaves 30% of the population out. At worst, that Ministry of Health is able to deliver to less than 30% of the population in times of conflict. We're not just talking about armed conflict, we're also talking about humanitarian crises, we're talking about floods and disasters. It is in those situations that the faith-based organizations are actually already there, as opposed to being parachuted in from outside to coordinate the delivery of humanitarian services and relief, and then parachuted out when things get a little bit iffy or tricky or dangerous or the money's run out. These are the people who will always be there, who have been there since time immemorial, whose main function in life is to provide basic services for their community, and not just health, but everything else. I saw this firsthand when I went to Iraq immediately after the US invasion. Where were people going for water? Where were people going for food? Where were people going for basic shelter? They were going to the mosques and to the churches, because there was nothing else functioning. There was no ministry of anything that was running. So de facto, you're talking about a context where if you are supposed to be in the business of delivering health, you are going to have to make sure that you at least know who those service deliverers are in those communities and help support them too. Yes, we must work with the ministries because we are an intergovernment organization. The government is our number one partner. But let's help the government reach those community providers. By all means, let's make sure that they're not ignored, and not only reach them in order to serve the people, but make sure that those who are serving the people sit with you in the capital when you're trying to plan out how you're going to divide and allocate your resources for the next 5 years to serve your people. Let the people who are doing the service sit with you at that policy table, because it cannot be only the same old clique that you will involve and you can go to those other guys later. No, if they can deliver the services, they should have a say in what policy gets made in the first place, in whichever capital in the world. So that was the argument that we started using. We provide facts, figures, that's why you need them at the table. Today we don't need to make that argument anymore. Today we're running around trying to say, wait a minute, okay, it's become so interesting, it's become so, excuse the pun, sexy to work with religion and religious organizations. It's really convenient to be able to invite this very eloquent, articulate speaker who happens to be the archbishop of this or the bishop of that, or the imam this or the imam that, or the rabbi this or the rabbi that. Very look wonderful, speak very elegantly, very articulately. Let's invite them here, there, and everywhere. Let's have these few high-level meetings with them. Right, we're done. Next. What's on the table next? Now let's get to the real business. Not good enough. Obviously not good enough. And it won't be good enough until our own culture in the UN changes. And that's not going to change until we have the courage to be able to unpack who we are inside the system, that make up the system. That'll take a while. But in this rush to involve and engage with religion, one thing is becoming increasingly obvious to me, who has been able to have the privilege to see this over the space of at least a decade. In the rush to engage with religious actors, which I think is brilliant, something falls through the cracks, and it's usually those sensitive issues on which you will really rarely ever get consensus when you bring all the religious people around the table, especially when, with all due respect to the gentlemen in the room, especially when they happen to be male religious leaders, who are, of course, the ones we like to invite because they look good and they speak well and they represent their organizations and they're very representative of everything in the universe. But when you invite them to the table, you miss women's voices badly. But even more critically, you miss the sensitive issues around which actually most revolve around women and women's rights. And it becomes the convenient thing that you don't want to create too much disharmony about. Over the years, we've done better at it. We've tried to put those issues on the table slowly. Women's representation within the religious hierarchies, women's participation in decision-making in the religious bodies and in the organizations. We've been able to get there. There are still some pretty sensitive areas that we aren't able and will never be able for a little while at least to put on the table. Can women be part of the decision about when to have children, how to have children, when to access education, how to access education, whether or not they can own and have a right to inheritance in their own context, even where it is still legally problematic to do so. Basic things which seem as if they're really reaching for the sky right now when you bring all these religious leaders to the table. And I think we need to be wary of that when we take that journey forward, which we are doing, is making sure that nothing falls through the cracks just because it's a sensitive issue. On the other hand, if it happens, as it is happening slowly, we in the UN system then stand to say, we're also letting a lot of things fall through the cracks inside our own system. we're not looking within to see how we can be better at appreciating who we are and what we bring to the table. So the journey continues, but we're so much further than we were when we started. Thank you.